A good number of shows, even great ones, take a while to truly find their footing. Sure, while all of the cartoons I'm currently showing on screen do have solid episodes from the very start, if you want to get to the really good stuff, like top 5 of the series level material, it's gonna take you a little bit. But that's not the case for every show. For whatever reason, whether it be the show having a limited number of episodes in the first place, or the crew just going into the series with a solid vision, sometimes you hit gold before you hit your first season finale, and that's exactly what Samurai Jack does. After only 6 episodes, 3 of which being part of the premiere movie, Samurai Jack delivers one of the most impressive pieces of animation that any series has ever put out in their first season, with 22 minutes of truly fascinating stuff, and that's what I want to break down today. In this video, we're going to be taking a deeper look at Jack and the 3 blind archers, and discuss how, through a story that could only be told in animation, Gendy's tour de force delivered its first masterpiece.
In my dreams, I still see arrows falling like rain.
If you've been watching my stuff for a bit, then you'd know I'm a pretty big defender of the 11-minute format. While I do understand the immediate appeal of statements like, imagine if Adventure Time and Steven Universe episodes were twice as long, I think people somewhat underestimate just how many episodes of those shows could just never function as half hours. It's simply really hard to stretch certain types of plots to a full 22 minutes, something that explains why most episodes of that length have B or even C plots, as they'd otherwise struggle to fully keep their audience's attention. None of that applies to this episode. However, if you were to break down each of these scenes based on how long they are without actually watching the episode, you'd begin to somewhat question that statement. There's no dialogue for the first 4 minutes, no Samurai Jack for the first 7, and no Jack and the 3 blind archers for the first 10. You could make an argument, a quite easy one in fact, that this episode is half setup. Something that sounds so easy to complain about, but it all just works so tremendously well. To start off, the episode delivers several minutes before a single arrow is fired of just watching this Viking chief lead his robot army through this quiet forest. A scene that immediately hits from multiple different angles. For starters, while this episode obviously has a commonly used title, and you'd find it pretty difficult to actually watch it without accidentally reading a synopsis, Samurai Jack doesn't have title cards, and at least on Max, this episode is just listed as VII. All of that to say, without outside influence, there's no reason to not believe that this giant army of robots destroying nature isn't going to be the main villain. In fact, I'd almost say it's implied that they are. Also, and obviously this only works on a rewatch, but just introducing the main area of the episode before we see it and it's full of snow is such a fun idea. Anyway, as we're eased into things, tension quickly begins to build, as we become more and more aware of the pure size of this marching crew, only left with the question of what they're marching towards, eventually revealed to be this seemingly unguarded tower. I just absolutely love how this shot is framed too, with the camera being placed with the army, giving us the same view as them when the tower's defense is revealed. And it's this moment where sacrificing a fourth of the episode solely to build tension becomes intimately worth it. This fighting force, which has now been built up for several minutes, is just immediately depicted as helpless, not even really putting up a fight against the barrage of arrows from above. The carnage is depicted in a way that only this show does too, with constantly switching aspect ratios that add such a uniquely dizzying feeling to this entire assault, a battle that's been turned into a massacre. As the victims are shown one final time, the series first subtly, then suddenly begins to shift from its usual battle-esque themes to something significantly more alien, and that's when we're finally fully introduced to the titular foes. Even then, this scene still has a few more tricks up its sleeve, knowing that the reveal of the 3 inhuman archers was enough to give this moment the impact that it needed, and deciding to only tease their lack of sight, with the final cry from the final combatant drawing the final shots. From start to finish, this 7-minute scene is genuinely one of the most well-crafted openings to any episode I've ever covered on this channel. Just being so ridiculously comfortable, trusting both its audience to tolerate the intentionally slow start, and the rest of the episode to capitalize on what it set up. Besides just establishing what exactly it was that the Viking and his army were after, the wish-granting treasure of King Osric, something that's accompanied by one of my favorites of the few jokes in this episode.
Treasure? Gold? Rubies?
Bah!
This scene also, at least for this episode, introduces the titular samurai. Given just how early in the show's run this episode is, it was fairly likely that this could be somebody's first look at the character, and they do such a terrific job of telling the audience just enough to get the protagonist without over-explaining why exactly a wish-granting situation would be more appealing to Jack than the average guy. This moment at the end here is almost certainly the neatest touch, with the show over-exaggerating response times to really drive in the difference between Jack and the Viking chief, with the latter responding to the samurai before he can even finish talking, and Jack being more than comfortable in the silence. This slower, more methodical approach is ultimately why Jack is going to be successful where the chief and his army weren't, so adding it here is just such a great touch. Anyway, moving off the boat, the rest of the first half of this episode mostly features one type of shot focusing on one thing, just how small Jack is compared to the world around him. Besides just seeing how this location has completely transformed in the winter, having Jack walk through all of these locations from the opening minutes just works to further show how, in comparison to the all-encompassing robotic mega army of the Viking, Jack is just a single man. A single man who's about to very quickly figure out how exactly the robotic army before him fell. As Jack approaches the tower from before, the episode begins perhaps the most impressive example up to this point of the show of its ability to avoid unnecessary monologues, as we watch Jack figure out that the archers are blind. This is something that, even if the viewer avoided knowing beforehand, that they would have likely figured out before the commercial break, especially after both the variety of symbolic clues, like Jack's eyes being covered before he loses his hat, as well as the more direct ones, like this shot of the archer's ear twitching before firing, but it's still really interesting to see our main character work towards it. And while pretty much every other cartoon, certainly every other one on the network, would have their protagonist vocalize their thought process, Samurai Jack instead shows it to us. We watch Jack first discover the accuracy of the archers, then the fact that blinding them doesn't work, then their tendency to only shoot an object once it creates a sound, and finally, their solid white eyes. It's almost like watching a super primitive version of something like a detective show, with our main character testing theories and slowly coming to a conclusion, all without actually saying a single word. It's just such great stuff. And thus, now with only 9 minutes left, the episode has finally fully set up its premise. There's a tower being guarded by 3 hyper-accurate blind archers, with Jack needing to get access to the wish-granting treasure at the very top. A premise that, while not inherently mind-blowingly cool, does, of course, set up a mind-blowingly cool final act, and one that kicks off with some meditation. And while this scene is probably my least favorite of the episode, as it feels significantly less subtle than the rest, even breaking the show's rules by having Jack verbally proclaim his revelation, it's still really interesting to get this glimpse into the character's past. It's only been 6 episodes since we first saw the Jack training montage that this scene presumably takes place during, and yet it's still really cool to see see him learn a fighting style that feels so separate from his own. If there was a valid complaint to be made about this episode, I think it would be that the solution that Jack finds here is admittedly a bit cartoonish, but it's this scene here that really sells it for me. His idea of blindfolding himself isn't to gain some type of supernatural connection to the world, it's more so to force him to rely on his other senses. The senses that the archers are forced to exclusively use. And it's that idea that's portrayed in the following scene, a scene that could only be done in animation. The general premise here is that, with Jack and the audience blindfolded, we become only aware of things that we can hear confirmation of. And it's the execution of this idea that creates this audio-visual experience unlike not only anything else in this show, but really anything else the medium has to offer. Samurai Jack, of course, excels at both creating tension, as we just talked about, and exhilarating action, which we're about to talk about. But I also just really love the unique ways that it manages to explore these serene settings. I know that right now, as you watch these clips being broken up into 5-second chunks without any of the sound, that it's somewhat hard to fully get it. But trust me here when I say that, as elegantly simple as it may be, it's just as effective at creating this overwhelming feeling of both connectedness with the world around you and the calmness that's brought by that connection. A calmness that's ultimately right before the storm. And after Jack confirms to the camera that he's ready, a kick-ass moment that even my desire for immersion can't complain about, the archers once again enter the episode, invading the calm soundscape with their alien tones and distorted drums, their towering perspective only adding to this feeling. And while I do think there was some level of challenge in making sure the following scene didn't just feel like Jack spent 8 minutes learning to run fast instead of just waiting for the arrows to hit him, something the show overcomes through shots of his ear and an increase in sound effects, the scene is just so fast-paced that it's impossible to do anything but appreciate it in the moment. The ending too is especially sick, with him doing the whole Matrix dodge as the archers take themselves out, but I think the episode understands that this isn't what should be the focus. There are obviously episodes of the show where the emphasis is put on the big fight at the center, but I think Jack and the Three Blind Archers is more interested at highlighting everything else that surrounds a conflict like this, which is certainly what the ending here goes for. As the archers' black exteriors begin to fade into more humanoid creatures, the action quickly gives way to several immediate questions. What turned these guys into unwilling killer guards? How exactly does this whole wishing thing work? And most importantly, what's going to stop Jack this time? Throughout all 22 minutes of a good chunk of episodes, Samurai Jack really tries his hardest to make you forget that, at the end of the day, the protagonist can't win and he can't go home. For the show to work, he has to fail over and over and over again. There's a moment at the end here that's such a subtle stroke of genius, as the archers look at each other, knowing what they have to tell him, and letting Jack go as long as he can before hearing it. In this moment, everybody besides him, from the men he just saved to the audience watching through the screen, knows that the samurai isn't going to get what he wants, and all are waiting for his response to discovering the monkey's paw aspect of this wishing well. I think that most shows in this moment would have their protagonist begin to ponder about whether or not they're going to use the wish anyway, but I appreciate this episode's decision to forego wasting that time. From the moment that Jack hears about the twist, he already knows what he has to do. Even if he wasn't going to be cursed or whatever, Samurai Jack just isn't going to use an evil well to get home. The only option that he was ever going to pick was going to be the option that he always picks. Good. But despite this inevitability, it doesn't stop the character from having this masterfully animated moment of frustration. The same ability to create tension that the episode already showed off is seen here too, as he gets more and more visibly distraught, only to finally snap and release this anger upon the well before sinking right back into stoic samurai mode. Even by only the 7th episode, Jack is already so familiar with the feeling of hopelessness that sinks in after every failed attempt to fix his situation, a feeling that ultimately has to be pushed to the side in order to move on to the next opportunity. And while, for the audience, the episode ends with a nice little monologue about how awesome and brave and selfless our main character is, for Jack, it ends the same way it started. A lonesome samurai in a land that he doesn't understand, desperately trying to get home.
Spirit, such sacrifice.
Although Samurai Jack may ultimately have better episodes, nothing that the series ever does even begins to take away from the 22 minutes they gave us here. Nearly everything that the show excels at, from building tension to establishing environments to creating action concepts that demand truly innovative fight choreography, can be found here, being done at an extremely high level, leading to an episode that truly flourishes from scene to scene. But even outside of that, besides just the overflowing creativity and general quality that it oozes out at every turn, I think the aspect of this episode I find myself most impressed by is its ability to bring all of these scenes together to create a unified identity or soul. When looking at each of these scenes separately, it feels like this episode just shouldn't work. I mean, you have several minutes of tension-filled setup, followed by this scene on the boat with almost film noir-esque pacing, leading into subtle investigation and transient meditation that's suddenly interrupted with a minute or two of fast-paced, in-your-face action that all culminates in this tragic acceptance of the status quo, and yet, despite all of this, it never feels like these scenes are as disconnected as I just made them sound. And maybe it all comes down to the themes and the motifs spread throughout, or just the general Samurai Jack flair that every scene in the show inherently has, but I think it's something much harder to explain, a general feeling of interconnectedness that this episode has. How each character, from the Viking chief to the archers to Jack himself, seem to parallel one another. How nature rebounds in between assaults on the tower. Just how every little thing in this episode seemed to mesh together to create this unforgettable landscape and story and general feeling. Before working on this video, it had been quite a bit since I had seen this episode, maybe even since I first reviewed it on this channel like 3 years ago, and yet this episode felt like one I never stopped watching, a fully formed world that I never really forgot, and that's the quiet brilliance of this episode. Even when compared to the other half hours in this series, Jack and the Three Blind Archers just feels like its own little place, its own little world filled with environments, characters, and ideas ready to explore. Anyway, that's about it for me. Thank you so much to everybody who stuck around to the end of this thing. I know that videos on this show tend to not do super great among my audience, but this series is just too dang fun to write about that I'll probably never stop just popping in every once in a while to praise a different episode. If you want to see even more of my bad takes on animation, but somehow in an even worse form, you can find my Twitter hidden somewhere in the description. But either way, this has been Ample Samuel, and I'll see you in a week or two to continue talking Infinity Train. Thanks for watching.